All right, hey, welcome back to Turn and Bark Time, episode 11. All right, so I'm the Turn.
I'm the Bark.
And we're going to be here a long time. So I'm going to be sitting at kind of a funky angle today. Just going to tell the crowd I had a really embarrassing moment today. I was riding my bike around, went out with my beautiful girlfriend, and we stopped in to get her bike looked at. And as I was getting off my own bike, my left foot hit the curb and rolled my ankle pretty solid. So I'm an idiot and I hurt myself in the funniest of ways, but that's okay. So that's why I'm kind of sitting way back today. Fun topic. We were kind of having that discussion. We didn't leave anything off with our last in content post, but we are talking today about the history of public education in the United States, because obviously we're in an unprecedented time where our nation has to go completely digital or just distance learning in general. And really unique situation. We got through our first week of teaching, and I think we learned a lot, and I think we got more to learn. So
that's true. I talked with a former colleague of mine who teaches now in Australia, and so things aren't that different as far as how we're teaching, and I think we're having a lot of the same struggles. Shout out to Google and Microsoft, and for those platforms being pretty solid. I haven't heard anybody say it's crashed. I have a cousin in Texas who they're using, I think, Schoology, and there's been some posts about like Schoology like going down, and I was like, 2 weeks ago I didn't know what that was, but I have heard of it now.
Yeah,
because that's what my cousin uses down in Texas.
Gotcha. Yeah, they talked about that. That's been a fairly successful thing. It's been the Google Classroom and Microsoft Teams platforms. We're using them for our classes. Shout out to our students. Hopefully you guys are staying safe out there, being well, and trying to kind of get back into our classrooms, which we really appreciate. So, but anyway, we're gonna talk about where did all this education start? So this really starts in Puritan, Massachusetts, which is kind of interesting. The first public school available to people in the United States was actually found in Boston. It was called the Boston Latin School, and it was founded in 1635. And it's both the first public school and the oldest existing school in the United States. Yeah, it still exists today. Probably not the same building, I hope.
John Hancock and Samuel Adams graduated from it. Benjamin Franklin dropped out.
Yeah, Benjamin Franklin had a tough go of it though. Had an abusive brother and everything like that. It wasn't really fun for him. Interesting here though, the first taxpayer-supported school, so free public education for people to go. Dorchester, Massachusetts. It's called the Mathur School. Opened in 1639. Now, what's cool about this was when I was doing my research was I was like, okay, what are they learning, right? Because you figure school today, you go, whether you're in elementary school or you're middle school or high school or even college, you select classes, and usually in the public education system, you're talking your math, your science, English, so reading and writing, social studies, some sort of history, right? PE, and then, as you get older, so the younger grades, right? PE, music, maybe some STEM or something like that. Middle schoolers start to get to pick those electives, and high schoolers obviously get a lot more pick. But this is what they were teaching. They were teaching, was it English methods of family? So my take of that was basically what a family is expected to do, what the children are expected to do, the husband, the wife. So they kind of teach them that. Teach them about the church, the community apprenticeships. So again, like learning a particular skill. And they're also a key thing of socialization, right? So building up those relationships between families and things like that. But reading, maybe writing to a lesser extent, and math are not considered subjects to be taught by somebody else. They're expected to be taught in the home, which I found really, really interesting. I think to the parents right now, and shout out to them for trying to help in any way they can, that could be kind of tough if you're expected to teach your child and have that expectation that your child is only going to know what you know. So later on, larger schools kind of open. And again, we're talking New England for the most part. The religious foundation in New England culture drives this idea that you need to be able to read because you need to be able to read the Bible, and worship it and use that as a part of your daily life. And again, they later on they're going to open up schools. They're going to call them grammar schools. Those are going to be like kind of like high schools, the closest comparison we have, and there are multiple of them. But again, they're private. They're not public. The public education is supposed to stop. What's interesting here is the divide between North and South. Actually, South, a lot less educational opportunities, especially public education, because you're living on these sprawling plantations. It's a different economy, right? People are poor, in that don't own these plantations and things like that. And so that's really going to be done by private tutors to basically the rich kids. Everybody else is not really going to have much of an education, kind of going forward, until basically Reconstruction. So the end of the Civil War, when a bunch of Republicans come down, and again, we're talking Republicans flip-flopped from what they are today. Today's Republicans would be called Democrats back in the day, and today's Democrats would be called Republicans back in the day. But anyway, Republican government comes in and mandates school, but they actually still keep it separate, blacks and whites, or people of color and whites. And that's where you're going to have that separate but equal system that'll be argued later on.
So back in New England, that's where education kind of starts to be formalized. Thomas Jefferson even comes out early on in the country's history and says we should have a education system that's paid for by taxes and provided. But he thought the future of the United States was going to be much more agrarian. Like when he sends Lewis and Clark out to find the West Coast, he thinks that it's going to take the United States like 100 years or something crazy, like by today's standards when we look back at history, because hindsight's always 20/20. But like his movement for the sprawl of the United States was much slower because he thought that people were only going to like build farms and live really, really, really sparsely populated and not start creating large cities like we have. Even like, it was like St. Louis or New Orleans, which was already there, Chicago, that are on these major rivers and whatnot. But anyway, Massachusetts makes the Board of Education in 1837, and a gentleman by the name of Horace Mann, who was from like kind of a common birth, common upbringing, went to Brown, graduates, and he becomes, kind of like what would be today the superintendent of public instruction, our Chris Reichdahl. But he talks about how education is the key to bridging social gaps and overcoming poverty. And a year later, Henry Barnard from Connecticut becomes kind of their superintendent for the state. And they start kind of like establishing minimum standards for like, what does curricula look like? What does a school look like? It's kind of one of those crazy things today. Like everybody, like when you think of school, like we have these like generic pictures. And so that's where we do start getting like this old school schoolhouse of like a one room, kind of little house on the prairie where there's, your high school kids, what would be high school kids today, all the way down through your like kindergarten kids are in the same one room. Everybody's got their little chalkboard and they're writing stuff. And that's when back when corporal punishment or like hitting kids was acceptable, and like putting a kid in a corner and like shaming them, which are a lot of things that we've changed education as we move forward. So there's not a federal Department of Education until 1867. And that was really more about seeing what states were doing and then using that information to help new states build education systems rather than kind of like dictating what they wanted from states. It was more of just kind of a tabulation of information and then like a helping, an assistance program for new states to figure out what they wanted to do.
And so then like we talk about the next thing that kind of moves forward is we get that we're up through like 1867, we've gone through the 1870s. So one of the big things is in the 1880s and 1890s, we get what was called the progressive movement, and this idea of the common person kind of rising up, getting treated with respect, things like that. And so there's this guy that you may have heard of him. His name's John Dewey. And I'm not sure, Parker, is he the same guy with the Dewey Decimal System?
I'm pretty sure he is.
Okay. Perfect.
I'm pretty sure. I was already wrong once today when I thought Dove chocolate and Dove soap was owned by the same person. They're not. Spoiler alert.
They're not? Oh, man.
No, they're not. Because I was like, how do you make soap and chocolate at the same time? I hope it's not the same process. Anyway, but yeah. No, I believe John Dewey is the same guy who came up with the Dewey Decimal System.
Okay. So, and again, for those who don't know, Dewey Decimal System is the way we organize nonfiction topics with a series of numbers. Okay, so he's basically an educational theorist. He is a philosophy professor at the University of Chicago, and then kind of works his way actually into the Teachers College at Columbia in New York City. But he's a big proponent of education for all. And one of his famous quotes here I have is, to prepare him for future life means to give him a command of himself. It means so to train him that he will have the full and ready use of all of his capabilities. And so one of the things here that he's kind of like pushing at this point is he's trying to basically change the way school is seen and theorized about. And he feels that like the more schooling you get, the better off you're going to be in this life and being prepared. And I would say that we can make an argument that today, mission statements from, elementary schools through high schools and us middle schools, represent junior high, middle schools, forgotten child, that's okay. That is our goal, right? Our goal is that our kids leave with every tool in their tool belts to take on any challenge or any problem, right? We live in a Google world where a kid doesn't need to know the day that Washington's inaugurated, right? Shout out, because that was one of our lessons. But they need to know how to solve that problem. And I feel like Dewey really like kind of pushed that for the whole system.
He wasn't the Dewey Decimal guy. The Dewey Decimal guy was before him. Sorry, was Melville Dewey. My bad, boy.
Yeah,
got you.
Our bad. So, again, one of the big things here is they're going to drive kind of a next step for education. So,
and by the time we get to like 1918, every state has some sort of a law requiring kids to go to elementary school, and it's not that surprising. This is like you start thinking about like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and he talks about like the terrible situations. And of course, The Jungle is technically fiction, but it was so graphic and terrifying and like horrifying about what factories were like and like the treatment of workers, and some of them being children, that it actually led to like the creation of like the Food and Drug Administration. And then you start seeing like a push that were like kids shouldn't be, at age like 7 and 8, like going to factories and like living in factories and sleeping in factories. And, I think even in like The Jungle, he talked about like there was children that fell asleep and then the rats came and ate them. And, that it's could be very well be hyperbole, but it led to this push where everybody's like, yeah, kids need to go to school. And it also took competition out of the labor force, because you have all the soldiers that were coming back from World War I that needed jobs, and they've been replaced by, like, instead of hiring an adult who's going to ask for adult money, I could hire kids who don't know how much money they should be getting, and I can justify paying them less. I can hire 3 kids instead of 1 adult and save money.
Yeah. One of the cool things here is after that, like, so we get that drive, and that's what gets us into what we call secondary schools, like high schools. And it's interesting because as like high schools grow, so like basically in 1880, the concern is like elementary school, right? And then like Bark said that it's in 1918 that we start to see mandatory elementary ed. But then there's just an explosion of high schools by the 1910s, and it continues to grow through the 1920s. But what's really interesting is this is also when sports gets added to school, right? And you and I both coach or like coaching and stuff like that. And this actually becomes a huge deal. In fact, something so cool, do you remember when we went to the Historical Society in town and we saw the basketball poster?
Yeah.
Quincy High School versus Wenatchee High School. What was that, like it was early, like 20s, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So it's super cool to see that. And again, those of you that play sports, right, that's when that stuff starts to get added. So again, what the point of high schools becomes kind of a college preparation. So before high school is mandated, high school is kind of a preparatory academy to get you ready to go to university. So those gap years between, probably finish elementary school in like 12, 13, right? And then up to 17 before you go away. So that was the big thing. But it gets pushed all the way up, and in the 1920s we actually started to see development of high schools, and kind of moving forward for that. And what's cool is that it's constantly changing, right? So one of our biggest things was that in 1896 we had the split, where these people African Americans argue in the South that separate but equal is unconstitutional. It violates the 14th Amendment, which is equal protection under the law. And the Supreme Court in that case ruled in favor of separate but equal, making sure that the actual things were equal, that did not violate the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Act. But it's going to be later in 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education that we're going to see the justices completely flip. And in a 9-0 vote, they are going to say that separate but equal is inherently unconstitutional, because when you are separated, you are not equal. And I've been listening to that on my podcast from that University of Nebraska professor. It's super fascinating on constitutional law. So
I want to say it was Revisionist History had a great podcast where they talked about one of the unforeseen impacts of desegregation is that it actually hurt educators of color, because when some of these schools, some of these districts, sorry, my dog just like burped over the table. Some of these districts, when they went from having like, a white school and a colored school, they simply just dismissed all of the teachers at the school, the non-white school, regardless of their performance. It was just simply, well, we don't need you. We have a set of teachers, and you think back to like, Hollywood's tried to cover this in like Remember the Titans, where they try and like be forward thinking and bringing in an African-American head coach. And there's, they've got to try and mold two schools together. Combining schools is difficult, but even, in that time period, it was even more tumultuous because of the social setting.
And one of my favorite movies, what's interesting about that you bring that up, is I believe that movie is set in 1971. And again, like I said, Brown v. Board of Education is decided in 1954. So desegregation, one of the things, the interesting thing that guy talks about on his podcast is he talks about how you still had places where people lived, right? Like we didn't do school. Like there was a black school because some people justified there was a black school because in that neighborhood, that's where black people lived, and that school serves that neighborhood, where over here the white people get that served. And so one of the solutions was actually busing, and like you had to take a number of kids out of the white neighborhood and send them to the black school, and a number of the black kids out of the black neighborhood and into the white school. And that's why I didn't realize that's what that was when they were protesting down on the first day of school and Remember the Titans, where it says Moms Against Busing. And I'm like, what are they talking about? But that's what it was. It was bringing kids out of what would be the school's boundary into there. And again, we don't see desegregation for a while because the Supreme Court rules on it. But again, the executive and congressional group did not really take a stance in this. Until later when we get like the Civil Rights Act and things like that. Other things that have made changes is in 1975 we get the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. So again, making sure that children with disabilities are able to do it. And then in 1990 we get probably one of the most famous ones that teachers have added to it's part of our job, is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is where we get special education and IEPs and things like that we're required to do as part of our job. And so we see that bringing kids in, including everybody, and we're pushing for that. So yeah.
At one point, I was reading through stuff. The state of California actually the California state government passed a law saying that like children of illegal immigrants shouldn't be allowed into public schools. Because they're not citizens and they're not paying taxes and whatnot, was the argument. And it got struck down. And that's one of the big things for public schools, is that we serve all the kids in our community, and the schools don't necessarily treat them any differently based on their status. And it's one of the big things that we always talk with our students about with our community is that we don't actively share that information with the government. We can actually like tell immigration or like law enforcement, like we don't have to divulge that information because that's part of their private information that we keep, that we use for our purposes, but we don't share that with other entities. We don't have to share.
Do you remember the year on that one?
I don't. I want to say it was in the 70s.
Okay, because that immediately made me think of Applier versus Doe. The Supreme Court argued 81, decided in 82. And that's the one where denial of a public education to students that are not legally admitted violated the Equal Protections Act. And in a ruling of, looks like 1, 2, 3, 4. So in a ruling 5-4, the court found in favor that you could not exclude undocumented children from your system. And Texas, what Texas had tried to do, I think it was the Applier School District, is they just, instead of like saying you can't come, they were charging them a fee, right? Like, hey, you got to kind of pay your taxes to go to the school. And so that was kind of the idea behind it. So
I know, I can't remember if it was at an AVID training or if it was at one of our culturally relevant trainings, teaching trainings. They were saying that in Dade County, Florida, where Miami is, that they had put a question on their admissions thing. They had a spot for a social security number, and that was, even though they weren't requiring it, the fact that it was there was preventing undocumented families from sending their kids to school because they were afraid that if they turned it in without the social, that was going to lead to them getting found out and deported or going through immigration services.
Right.
So it's really interesting, like, with the census coming up, and that was an issue with the census, like, are you a citizen, being part of one of the questions that they wanted, but eventually I didn't see it when I took it.
I didn't.
I don't think they put it on there because I think they realized it was going to be too big of a fight.
But it's also like if people really want to know how many people are in this country, right? Like, we need to have that question. So, or we need to get rid of that question.
Yeah, just so we get accurate information, as accurate information as possible.
Correct. So
I think it's really interesting because, like, when we always kind of like have this argument about like, what is the purpose of school? And like, is it to prepare kids for jobs? And the answer is, well, yes. That's why we have this, CTE is growing, career and technical education. Our high school has a coffee shop in it where kids can learn a barista skill, which obviously we don't want them to grow up and just be baristas the rest of their life, but it's a good skill to have when you go to a college town, or a good job, like, that you can work getting out of high school to get you somewhere else. Yeah. They can learn how to screen print. They can learn how to, do video productions, website. We have our TEALS program that works with Microsoft where they learn they actually have like I think they Zoom, or probably with Teams, use Teams, and they video conference with people from Microsoft, to learn, not just with our district staff, but actually with people from that company. So you're starting to see more and more of these high school relationships with companies in the local area, where companies are saying, we want kids to come out of high school and be ready to do this when they graduate. And the answer to, well, how do we do that is, we'll offer a class or two that almost becomes an apprenticeship. Like our Desert Dental, I think Desert Sun Dental offered they had an advertisement in the high school bulletin for weeks saying that they wanted somebody to come in who was interested in being a dental hygienist and come intern with them as a high school kid. And I don't remember those opportunities being around in the early 2000s as readily. Yeah. Or even like my wife's brothers, who graduated about 5-6 years after we did, they had a lot more, that shift had occurred like between the early 2000s, like 2003 and like almost 2010.
Yeah, and I would make an argument, like, because when I went to high school, we had electives like you would normally see, right? Like band, choir, art, orchestra, those kind of things, PE classes, right? But we had aviation classes. Like, there was a whole aviation series. We had marine biology, which I did. Shout out to Mr. Hibbs. I don't think he ever watches these, but shout out to Mr. Hibbs. Fun class. We had early child development classes. We had, all sorts of science classes. We had, natural resources biology, like all these different things that were were way more. We had coding, we had the graphic design, we had all those kind of classes, and so it's really interesting to kind of see those skills. And that's kind of where high school has gone. So
shoot, big shout out to Mr. Cool and Mr. Wallace. Our ag program at Quincy is
right,
phenomenal.
and Miss Averill too, right? Like the business school. I mean, those kids come out with real school, and what's cool is that her first career was working in the hospitality industry, and so those kids get like real world knowledge that's right in front of them. And I know that like Mr. Wallace Farms and all these things. I mean, it's like super cool to see that kind of develop. And one of the big things that we would make an argument for is this is the stuff that keeps kids in school, right? Like I might hate math, I might hate reading, writing, whatever, history even, we know that. But I'm coming to school every day because I get to work on a tractor, or I get to raise pigs, or whatever it is. I get to help screen print stuff. I get to run a store. Those are the kind of things that help people. So
get to work with their hands. The other one other kind of like goal is, I was looking at some stuff and people keep saying civic participation, making sure that like students understand like how the government works. And I'm part of a grant right now where we're working on trying to get media literacy, having people be able to look at stuff online and realize, is this legitimate stuff or is this illegitimate? Like, is it true or is it not true? Before we retweet or repost something.
Yeah.
I saw a post come across Facebook that was talking about how Dr. Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, had said, we need to develop a herd mentality, and as soon as you let people give you this vaccine, mandatory vaccines, it's just all downhill, and we start losing so many freedoms. And so many people were reposting it, and I was like, one quick Google, and everything says Kissinger never said that. You know what I mean? And just teaching kids, like, we're not teaching kids like which way to vote. We're teaching kids have reasons for why you vote.
Yeah.
Right? Be able to look at it and say, why do I like this candidate versus the other? What's important to me, and which one of them is that more important to?
Right.
And I think that's a big thing that we miss out a lot of times, is like getting kids to be, active in participating in democracy.
Yeah.
Our voter turnout in the last 50 years has bounced between like 50 and 60%. And it's the last century, that's where it's been. And you kind of think about that and it's like, wow, like if you look at that as a school grade, we might have squeaked by with a D, but for the most part, most elections, like we talked about in 2016, it was record turnout.
Yeah.
For the number of people, but percentage wise, it was still in the mid 50. I think it was like 54%.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see, come this November, to see, because presidential elections are always the biggest turnouts. I mean, it's just hands down. You feel like you have more on the line, bigger stake and stuff like that. This election will be just as big, dealing with COVID, the economy, and everything else. So anyway, at the danger of rambling. Oh, go ahead.
That's why we do mock elections, though.
Yeah.
Is so that kids can practice that opportunity to look at information and make a choice.
Absolutely. And one of the big things is we ask kids to do their own research, and we talk about both candidates or all the candidates that we can. So, again, it's a really interesting time to be alive. It's really fun, and we're hoping you're joining us for these videos. And anything else, public education?
We'll see where it goes in the future. I mean, like one of the things is that some people are there are becoming more online options. We have charter schools. We have, there's obviously still private schools, and public schools are trying to respond and be, it's the thing that we're thinking about as teachers is what is the impact on public schools of COVID, like this distance learning. Are some districts going to start offering a district learning program? Is that something, because we're all building more familiarity with online platforms and students are learning it. And are we going to start getting away from the 7:30 to 3:30 and become more flexible? I mean, this is all up in the air. Like, don't read anything into this. Like, we push blocks at the bottom of the pyramid. Yeah. We have no power. Yeah. So don't read anything into this. We're just, asking questions. Like, is it going to change how we do things?
Well, and I heard a guy tell me that at Fred Meyer in Ellensburg, and he was like, yeah, man, he's like, I'm just going to go. It'll be nice because I can just do my own thing. And I was like, that's great. I was like, but reading a great, or finished a great book on the generation, behind me and us, and they're one of the loneliest generations there is. School is one of the things that actually gets them to go out and do things. And obviously there's outliers and things like that, but the generation as a whole has found more interest in online, not necessarily learning, but being online instead. So,
and I would say that's overwhelmingly the response we're getting from our students is that they're bored and they miss school because of their friends, and even because of their teachers.
Whoop, whoop.
Yeah. Whoop. I'm sure it's like this much teachers, this much students, but hey,
easy.
That's a win.
I'll take my tiny little slice. It's worth it.
Amen.
So, all right. Until next time, I'm Turn.
I'm Bark.
And we're going to be here a long time. Have a good night, everybody.
Stay safe.
And be well.